gesso is essentially a word in Italian that means plaster or gypsum. And this term has been used by commerce to market the products that are sort of similar. So we're going to break it down. So the true gesso is essentially a brittle chalk white ground made by mixing hot animal glue, which I've mentioned in our last presentation. Usually this is rabbit skin glue with finely ground calcium carbonate and or gypsum. Apply multiple warm layers over a glue-sized rigid support such as panel for tempera or gilding. It dries hard. It can be scraped and polished glass smooth, and it's highly absorbent. Ideal for egg tempera and water gilding. Now, a lot of you have been asking me about fabric supports. Can this be used on canvas or linen canvas? And I've mentioned that a lot of Venetian artists did use this support for uh, some of their masterpieces. And this is common in Venetian painting of the late Renaissance. They developed ways to make the gesso more flexible by applying it in a specific way. So I mentioned that in other videos. You could refer to those videos in my library. So today I just want to focus on panel supports, on rigid supports. So now let's define the acrylic gesso. So in the 1950s, it was developed by the Liquitex Corporation, founded by Henry Livingston. And this was, it's a material that combines acrylic polymer with titanium dioxide, which is a pigment, and calcium carbonate. And this is what most of you use today. This is a wonderful material. I don't want to make you think that I'm putting it down in any way or form. I use it myself in a lot of my quick demonstrations, but it does have very different um, qualities. And this is important to highlight. For a lot of you that are coming by and see a lot of the more traditional videos about the old masters, and I break down all the techniques. When I say gesso, I'm not referring to the acrylic gesso that we use today. A lot of art stores carry this beautiful, wonderful material that I've got to say it's a beautiful, wonderful material. You could create large paintings and put multiple layers. It will stay flexible, but you do not get a lot of the different qualities that you would with the traditional or true gesso. So I wanted to highlight those differences. So one of the most important aspects of this material that I'm going to be highlighting here in a demonstration is the scraping of the gesso. You cannot really scrape acrylic gesso. We're going to try to do it today. I have everything set up for you guys, and I'm going to be uh, demonstrating how you could scrape a panel using a blade or a metal scraper to polish the surface. Most artists today do not even understand this method because it's a method that got lost to time. I mean, by the late Renaissance, I would say late Renaissance, beginning of the beginning of the 17th century to mid 17th century, this art of scraping the panel was already lost. Artists such as Rubens and Rembrandt continue to use this technique, but for the most part, a lot of artists just gave up the practice completely, and they just began to use oil priming over the panel. So this is, a really wonderful material, the acrylic gesso. I've had a lot of you ask me, well, do you use the rabbit skin glue before and then the acrylic gesso? And I want to completely, be adamant about this once again. You don't need rabbit skin glue if you are using the acrylic gesso. You just apply 1 or 2 layers, maybe 3 layers of acrylic gesso over fabric, and you're done. But if you're wanting to create, for example, a wooden panel using the traditional gesso, then you're going to need the rabbit skin glue. This is important because if not, the wood will absorb the rabbit skin glue, and you'll get um, you get different erratic effects on the wood. So it's best to apply the rabbit skin glue first, let that dry, and then the traditional true gesso. So I want to break down the materials that are involved when defining these materials. So just to define the actual materials. So the acrylic gesso is an acrylic polymer emulsion versus the traditional gesso mentioned by Cennino Cennini, which is hot animal glue. This is the binder. And in this case, they're using some sort of parchment or hide glue. Nowadays, we're using rabbit skin glue, which is a superior material to perhaps parchment glue. There has been a lot of studies on parchment glue, and they find that rabbit skin glue, the modern rabbit skin glue, is superior. So I use rabbit skin glue for my traditional gesso. For the acrylic gesso, it's acrylic polymer emulsion, right? So in terms of the pigment, so the acrylic gesso has a pigment. It's titanium white, whereas the traditional gesso or the true gesso does not have a pigment. It's just gypsum by itself. When the gypsum dries completely, it dries perfectly white. It depends. Some materials, and I'm going to be very specific about this. If you, for example, refine the gypsum, heat it to a certain degree, and slake this material, it will give you a wider, finer material. This is the material that is described by Cennino Cennini. Very specialized material. It cannot be purchased today. You sort of have to do this on your own. When you buy the Italian gesso, a lot of times it's just Terra alba, which is um, it's essentially a raw gypsum. It has not been cooked or slaked. So this is something to take into account. Today I'm going to be demonstrating a chalk and glue ground. So it's essentially chalk, natural chalk and glue. This is used by northern painters, and southern painters from Italy use the gypsum. So I'm going to get into that in a little bit. So in for the acrylic gesso, the filler is essentially calcium carbonate, which is the same as the traditional gesso. You could use calcium carbonate in the traditional gesso or gypsum. Very confusing, but I'm going to try to break it down, and I have these charts that you guys could refer to. So the vehicle and or the solvent in this case for the acrylic gesso is water, and water also for the traditional gesso, and this is used to dissolve or swell the glue. This is important to take into account because if you're using, for example, a linen support, you're doing this over fabric support, and you're using a lot of water. Well, that could essentially create distortion. So you have to be very adamant about the proportions that you're using for the glue. And I have a whole class dedicated to preparing the glue and preparing the surfaces, because it's not just reading the materials and putting them together. There's a lot of confection that goes into making these materials. So additives that they put in the acrylic gesso, usually they add other ingredients such as thickeners, pH adjusters, ammonia. So I'm not really sure about these specific materials for specific companies. I know that usually if I use acrylic gesso, I'll use the Liquitex gesso. They invented it, and essentially it's the best gesso that I've used. There's other brands, but I stick to Liquitex gesso if I'm using, if I want to use an acrylic modern material over board or over canvas. I usually will put 2 or 3 layers of acrylic Liquitex gesso. It's my favorite gesso to use, or acrylic gesso to use. So for the Cennino Cennini gesso, the additives are none. It's essentially gypsum and glue. So there's no other materials. Sometimes I've seen in some of the acrylic gessos that they'll add marble dust, calcium carbonate, titanium dioxide. For the traditional gesso, it's just gypsum or calcium carbonate and animal glue. And that makes a big difference. When you are putting these materials together, the more materials that you're mixing, you run into problems. So I keep it simple. I follow the Cennino Cennini recipe, traditional gesso is very fragile, and you have to be aware of that. I mean, you when you're making these materials, take into account that the recipe has to be just right, or you get crackings. That's why a lot of people shy away from the traditional gesso and just use the acrylic gesso because it's easier. So, Frank Amador, thank you for coming by. I really appreciate the visit. Again, if you guys have any questions, feel free to post your questions in the chat and I'll try to answer some of your questions. So, in terms of the intended supports, so for the acrylic gesso, it's pretty flexible. You could use canvas, you could use wood, you could use paper. So in that regard, the acrylic gesso is superior to the traditional gesso. A lot of you tell me, well, why would you even use the uh, traditional gesso versus the acrylic gesso? It's just a superior material. Well, there's specific options and there's specific situations where I would use the traditional gesso. For example, if I'm working on a panel support for a portrait, there's a lot of beautiful Raphael portraits, Rembrandt portraits, Rubens portraits that are painted on panel, on oak panel and poplar in particular. And these are beautiful surfaces. They're scraped smooth. And when you apply the imprimatura, as I'm going to show you, you get this beautiful luminous quality. And that is very difficult to achieve in the traditional, excuse me, in the acrylic gesso. So we're going to see side by side the different imprimaturas as they go on the panels. So in terms of the traditional gesso, well, I wouldn't recommend using the traditional gesso on anything except a nice rigid support, such as a solid wood panel or a nice heavy plywood panel. And if you're going to use it on canvas, you need a specific proven recipe to do this. So it tends to be brittle, and a lot of artists get cracking. So just be aware of that. So in terms of different gesso supports, and again, when I say gesso, it could mean the chalk and glue or the calcium sulfate and glue. So it seems like artists from Italy tended to use calcium sulfate. This is a material that comes from gypsum, essentially. There's deposits in the north of Italy, the Dolomites. That's where they extracted a lot of these deposits of gypsum. And artists from Italy, the north part of Italy, central Italy, and even southern Italy, seem to have used this material. But north of the Alps, artists from Flanders, the Netherlands, and Germany seem to have used calcium carbonate, and in particular, natural calcium carbonate. So I've tested out natural calcium carbonate, specifically a material that I get from Kramer Pigments. It's called chalk from Champagne, and it's a beautiful material. It's what I use, and this is the material that you guys are going to see on the panel that I prepared. And why do I use this material? Well, it has a fine particle size, so you don't have to grind it with a mauler or water. This is another technique that artists used. They could grind the gesso or the calcium carbonate on a mauler or in a stone and mauler. So you could reduce the particle size and then levigate this material by, selecting a particle, very fine particle size. This is a practice that was mentioned by a lot of manuscripts. So artists from the north would use the natural chalk, and Rubens, Rembrandt, the Van Eyck brothers, a lot of artists from Germany use the natural chalk. This is a beautiful material. Now, in Italy, they developed their own methods to create a particle selection. So, if you slake this material, for example, calcium sulfate, if it's heated and you slake it, meaning you submerge it in water and you let it sit for a few weeks, you get a different particle size. There's a beautiful crystalline structure that develops, and this seems to be the definition of gesso sottile. So gesso sottile means a very fine gesso. So this is what Giannini mentions in his treatise, but they also use gesso grosso. What does that mean? Well, it means that the gesso is slaked and it's immediately used. So you could use this material that has been slaked, take it out of the water, dry it. They would make these loaves. It's essentially a solid, and then they would mix that with the rabbit skin glue. Or you could just use the raw gypsum. So it depends what you're looking for. So if you're looking for a very, very fine gesso where you're going to apply gold leaf, as I mentioned in my last live presentation for the Imprimatura, you get this gorgeous surface and very luminous. So this seems to be the techniques that they employed. So both artists from the north and from Italy employ animal hide glue. Again, you could use the rabbit skin glue today. And for the Italian system, there seems to be some initial layers of gesso grosso topped by multiple coats of gesso sottile. And these top layers were scraped smooth using a scraper. And you could do this with a technique that Cennino mentions in his treatise, which I'm going to be demonstrating. So usually for the northern artists, they use a single type of layers. So meaning you could layer many, many layers, one single layer, but in subsequent layers of the chalk and glue ground, meaning you start with one layer, you let it dry slightly, and then you immediately apply the other layer. When all these layers dry together, they combine into one solid layer. And this is the technique that the artists from the north use. This is a faster method. When you're employing the gesso grosso and the gesso sottile, it just takes a lot longer. So by the 17th century, artists such as Rubens and Rembrandt were employing this method. It was faster. It's a lot more thinner, so you don't have to build as thicker of layers. So meaning when you're applying, perhaps 4 or 5 layers of gesso grosso, you have to let those layers dry, and then immediately a day or 2 days after, you're going to employ maybe 5 or 6 more layers of the gesso sottile. That's like 3 days of work, maybe 4 days of work after scraping and waiting for the imprimatura to dry. So that's almost a week of work to prepare a panel. So by using the northern artist method, it's just a lot faster. So these are distinct qualities that you get with the different materials. Now you cannot do this with the acrylic gesso. There are artists that will apply perhaps 4 or 5 layers of acrylic gesso, and then they will wet sand the acrylic gesso with a sand screen. I've tried that method and it works really well, but you cannot get the very, very smooth polished surface of the traditional gesso. You could get something close, but it's not as luminous, and it's just not going to give you the same absorbency. So in terms of materials that you would need, so for the chalk and glue ground, you could use any type of chalk. Kramer Pigments sells these amazing chalks from Bologna. He also sells chalk from Champagne, from Germany. So you could use these materials, test them out. And in terms of the calcium sulfate, well, you would need Terra alba or Bologna chalk. And then you have to cook it. Well, you could also use the raw gypsum. You could use Italian gesso, which is sold by a lot of artist suppliers, and try that. So the idea is just to sort of experiment with these materials. You could also make your own acrylic gesso. So by combining acrylic polymer and titanium dioxide and chalk or calcium carbonate, you could make your own gesso, your own homemade gesso, acrylic gesso. So the formulas, well, you have to test them out. Each individual supplier has their own formulas. So just make sure to write this down as you're working, and you could use different panels to make tests. And that's what I do with a lot of my materials. So, um, okay, so I want to present to you a case study here of a Rembrandt painting that I absolutely love. This is a woman bathing in the stream. This is a painting that was painted in 1654 by Rembrandt. And he's using here an oak panel. A lot of these artists were using, from the north, were using Baltic oak, which I've mentioned many times in my live presentations. And this is really interesting. So it seems like Rembrandt, for the most part, used the northern method. He's using a single type of ground, meaning a single layer. They would probably build 5 or 6 layers, and it's essentially identified as natural chalk. The elemental composition has not been identified. This is from Art in the Making, Rembrandt from the National Gallery, published in 2006, page 224. And then the Imprimatura that goes right on top of this um, chalk ground is lead white, yellow brown earth, and umber. So I thought it would be fun to recreate this very, very beautiful ground by Rembrandt, and that's exactly what we're going to be doing. So what is Rembrandt doing here? Well, when you build these very beautiful translucent layers of chalk and glue, you want to have enough material to scrape down these layers. If you, for example, just use 2 layers of the chalk and glue and you want to get a very beautiful smooth surface, if you scrape very hard on your surface, you're going to pull away all the gesso. So they would build enough layers, for example, 5 to 6 layers, to be able to scrape this panel very smoothly and leave a very thin film of just a very thin strata of chalk and glue. And over this, they would seal it with an imprimatura. And I've had a lot of you ask me, well, isn't this violate the fat over lean rule? And all sorts of questions. Well, the chalk and glue is very absorbent. So if you were to paint directly on this scraped chalk and glue ground, it would suck all your oil from your paints, as I mentioned before in my other live presentations. So by using the imprimatura, you get a unifying color, which I've mentioned in the last live presentation, and you get to seal the very porous, very absorbent chalk and glue ground. This is the standard method for a lot of these artists during this era. Artists from Italy, for example, Leonardo da Vinci, as I mentioned in the case study from the Imprimatura live presentation, he uses a strictly lead white ground right over the calcium sulfate animal glue gesso. And he's using this to seal the underdrawing. I mentioned that in the last video. You could refer to the video in the description below. So the Rembrandt method is completely different. He's influenced by Rubens, and I found some very peculiar similarities between Rubens and Rembrandt. It seems like Rembrandt is essentially, I wouldn't say copying, he's just adapting the method that Rubens is using. And he's using almost like a streaky imprimatura, very beautiful, thin imprimatura that allows the white chalk glue ground to show through. So let's see, I have some questions. I want to address your questions. Philip Murphy, thank you for coming by once again. I know you've been joining some of the other live presentations. Welcome. So how can one test the strength of the rabbit skin glue when making gesso? Does the strength even matter? The strength is everything, absolutely everything in this. And I would say that there's a lot of formulas out there, and I wouldn't even dare start, putting numbers out there, because what I found is that if you, for example, buy rabbit skin glue from one supplier, it has a different strength than another supplier. It depends if it's powder. It depends if it's pellets. If some artists buy the rabbit skin glue and the gesso ready made, and that has different proportions. So um, I I teach a course dedicated to this, and it's very involved. So if you're interested in learning these techniques, I recommend that you sign up for a course. This is an involved process, and I've had a whole semester students that have studied under me destroy surfaces in the process of learning how to do this, and it's because you don't you there's not a standardized method. I mean, Shanini, for example, mentions to use the leaf. There's rabbit skin glue that is sold in leaves, and that has a different proportion altogether. So it's essentially testing out the glue and testing out the strength. So I'm going to give you just a little pointer. The the rabbit skin glue, if it's made properly, will not stain. When you apply the imprimatura, it will not stain the gesso. So if your glue is too weak and you apply the imprimatura, you'll see all the oil soak into into the gesso, and your gesso will be ruined because the strength of the glue is just wrong. So I hope that answers your question. Thank you for coming by. So let's see. Amnes, is marble dust or original chalk better to use for glue grounds as described from Germany? So it depends what you're wanting to achieve. Marble dust can be replaced. You could use chalk, you could use marble dust, but the marble dust sometimes it depends the particle size. So if you use a marble dust that has a large particle size, you're not going to be able to scrape the panel very smoothly. It will be smooth, but it will not, it could be porous as well. So the particle size makes a difference. And the chalk from Germany is wonderful. I mean, I use champagne chalk. This seems to be the closest material to what Rubens and Rembrandt were using. Well, it comes from the region of Champagne. So this is in the northern part of France, in the border of France and Belgium, and this is in proximity to what the old masters from the north were using. So I've used that material. It's a wonderful material. For me, it makes the best gesso, and I highly recommend it. So if you guys are interested in purchasing that, I get it from Kramer Pigments, and it's a beautiful material. Now, in terms of the materials that Rembrandt used, for example, he's probably, I mean, there's evidence that they have done micro photographs of the structure of the chalk. By the way, this book, Art in the Making, is very insightful. It's a wonderful book. I have it in my collections for many years, and I've learned so much from this book. So I'm very grateful to the information that they published at the National Gallery. And with this information, you could kind of break down the process. Rembrandt is using a natural chalk because in the micro photographs, they find fossil formations. And this is typical of a natural chalk. If you're grinding down, for example, marble and creating a natural calcium carbonate, it will not have that crystalline structure, or in the micro photographs, you will not see those fossil formations. So that's how they identify that it's a natural chalk, and there's a chapter that is dedicated to this in that book. So let's see, do I have any more questions? So let's see, Philip Murphy. What's porcine skin glue used in the past? Was there any advantage over rabbit skin glue? So yes. So Spanish artists mention the use of pigskin. I have never used pigskin glue. That's something that I'll have to try in the future. But apparently, modern science tells us that rabbit skin glue is superior. There has been a lot of tests and some research done by conservators that have published their results. I think I have a technical journal that has the chemical analysis and reconstructions using 5 types of rabbit skin glue, excuse me, 5 types of animal glue, and they define the rabbit skin glue as being superior. So that's something that, I have not tried. I usually take into account the research done by a lot of these scientists, and I'm assuming that they're correct in this assessment. So, but it would be interesting to see what the pigskin glue, how it behaves, the strength of it. I mean, it was used by perhaps Velasquez and a lot of the Spanish artists, maybe even some Italian artists. So that would be an interesting experiment for the future. So, all right. So what I want to do is I want to switch gears here, and I want to share with you guys my, let's see, um, I've set up here a whole working sequence, and I'm going to switch now. I'm going to turn off my camera, and I'm going to go to my working station where you guys are going to be able to see how I prepare this panel. So this panel right here is essentially a chalk and glue. This is champagne chalk, and I want to show you this side by side. This is acrylic Liquitex gesso side by side. And I have a lot of you asking me, well, is the chalk and glue whiter, or is the acrylic gesso whiter? Well, you can see here the difference. This is a chalk and glue, okay, using rabbit skin glue and champagne chalk from Kramer Pigments. And this is the traditional, or I guess the Liquitex gesso that is usually, purchased in the regular art store. This is a wonderful material, and this has about 4 layers of 5 layers of gesso. It's a wonderful material, but you can see the difference immediately. I mean, this seems more luminous, it's a lot whiter, but you cannot use this panel like this. This has to be scraped smooth. So by scraping this smooth, I mean, you can see that the surface is kind of rough, and you can see the ridges of the application of the gesso. So what I want to do is I want to show you the method that Cennino Cennini describes in his treatise, El Libro dell'Arte, in the method of how you're going to scrape this smooth. So I'm using a scraper, and the scraper is essentially a piece of metal. This is my scraper right here. Okay, this is just a metal plate, and I have different ones. This is for a smaller panel, and I will use this to scrape the panel by just running the blade up and down. Okay, this is a material that, it will scrape very beautifully. When metal hits the gesso, you could get this beautiful surface. So the method that is employed by Cennino Cennini calls for charcoal. This is essentially ground up charcoal. And he mentions to apply the charcoal over the surface, and you'll be able to see where it needs scraping. So this is essentially a guide to help you along. Okay, so you do this to be able to see the ridges and where it needs to be scraped. Otherwise, it's just white, and you won't be able to detect where it needs scraping. Now, who's doing this today? Well, I would dare to say hardly anybody. This is a lost art, and a lot of artists from the past were doing this. Probably as studio assistants were doing this. So what we're going to do is we're going to use our scraper. We're going to scrape the gesso. Now, a lot of you ask me, well, what is the difference between the two? This essentially is the difference. You can't do this with acrylic gesso. If you do this, you'll go right to the surface and peel the plastic, which the acrylic gesso is plastic, right? So I'm going to show you this. So you can see there where the gesso just scrapes beautifully. And the the charcoal is guiding you. It's telling you where you need to go next. So by doing this, you're evening out the surface. And this is a lost art. I mean, this takes a lot of skill to do. Sharpening the blade requires a specific, a way of sharpening it. Otherwise, it will not scrape the gesso. So you can see immediately how you're getting this beautiful white surface. It's a lot whiter than what we began with, right? So this will require hours and hours of scraping. And luckily I've already scraped one panel for you guys. So what I want to do is I want to bring that panel, and you can see that this is essentially dust. This is just the chalk, or in this case, chalk and glue. And a lot of artists use this for to put in the back of their canvases. They also used it for to pick up oil from, if you, for example, spill oil, you could use this on a sheet of paper and pick up some of the oil. So it's very useful. You should keep it, not throw it out. Not throw it out. So you can see there that, I mean, just that little scraping, how the surface just becomes smoother, right? So I want to show you now a panel that has been perfectly scraped, and we're going to apply an Imprimatura over this panel. So this one has been scraped, and when you apply the Imprimatura, that's what we're going to do right now. We're going to apply an Imprimatura of Umber. So I'm going to get some Umber here. Let's see, we're going to do a little Umber. So I have some Umber. These are handmade pigments, important because they do behave different. So some Umber, black, in this case, bone black and Umber. And I'm using a bristle brush to do this, okay? And this is the most mysterious thing. I'm using cold press washed linseed oil, okay? And I'm gonna be using this without any medium, without any solvent. And this is not going to stain my gesso. That's the big component there. And I'm using stack process lead white, which is important. I mentioned this in a lot of my other videos. The lead white creates a translucency that is unique. And you can see there, stack process lead white. You can't see it with the camera, but you'll be able to see it on the surface. So this is just umber. Identify the umber and a little bit of yellow, brown yellow. So I'm using a little yellow ochre, and I need a lot of oil to do this. And this will actually dry very thinly. You won't be able to look at this beautiful Imprimatura. And for a lot of you that are, wanting to know how Rembrandt and all these artists created these streaky Imprimaturas, well, it's the gesso. It's not a special medium. It's just gesso. It just gives you this perfect Imprimatura. And the lead white, I'm using yellow ochre. So I can make it a lot more opaque. They find yellow, brown, lead white, and umber, right, in the Rembrandt. So for that little beautiful painting. So that's essentially what I'm using. Cypress umber. And because it's warmer. I suspect that he was using something similar. So this is the color. And this is a gorgeous surface to work on. And you can see that it's keeping the luminosity. And we're going to apply the same Imprimatura over our acrylic just to see, compare it side by side. So by using a bristle brush, you get this beautiful streaky Imprimatura by running it. Now, if you just use the pigments without the lead white, you wouldn't get this nice, the stack process lead white gives you that luminosity that is particular to this technique. So I'm going to be answering some of your questions shortly. When I finish the demonstration, we'll have a Q&A. So there you can see what a gorgeous surface this gives you. And I'm going to, now, will this dry shiny like this? Absolutely not. In a couple hours time, the chalk would have soaked into the surface, but not discoloring the gesso. Okay, and there you can see what a gorgeous surface that is. This is very similar to what you would see in Rembrandt or Rubens. You can even make it more streaky by pressing harder. You can see that the gesso has not been discolored. So let's try this now with the acrylic gesso. The first thing that I want to do is I want to try to scrape the gesso to see if, I've had a lot of you, yes, you could scrape the gesso, the acrylic gesso, there's, why bother? So let's just try to do that. So immediately you can see that it's what it's done is scratching it, So yeah, it's not really going to help us out to try to scrape it. So I'm not even going to try. So perhaps we could sand it. Let's try to sand it a little with pumice, just to get a nicer surface. So you can see that what it's doing is sort of scratching the surface. So the pumice is perhaps not the best option, but it gave us a little. You could use a finer sandpaper or even wet sandpaper. That's okay, and it'll do a better job. But what I want to do is I want to just put an Imprimatura right over this, because a lot of you probably are wondering, well, what does the Imprimatura look like? So this very same Imprimatura from the same batch. You can see very different. The brushwork is different. You don't get the sort of smooth out. This is what a lot of you, and I'm using straight oils, so that means that this could dry a little fatty because it's not going to be as absorbent. So for a lot of you that are using the acrylic gesso, you probably don't want to use straight oil to seal this because it'll just be very fatty. So you probably want to use a solvent, and when you use the solvent, you're not going to get the same qualities as the, and you just see side by side. We're going to put them side by side shortly. So same Imprimatura. And you're getting a little streaking, but it's very different, the quality. And look at this side by side. You can see the difference. Okay. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and take your questions for a lot of you that are coming by and have your questions. So let's see. Do I have any questions? Let's see. So Florian, thank you for coming by. Appreciate your visit to the channel. Let's see. Costello. Hi, Luis. Did they use a flat brush for Imprimatura? I thought they didn't use flat brushes before 19th century. You're absolutely right. I do have one of those round brushes that I do not have available right now, but I have used it. So yeah, so you're absolutely right. They did not have that type of brush prior to the 19th century, but it doesn't. In this case, the brush that I'm using is sort of round at the ends. It's not a complete flat, so wouldn't make that much difference. You get the same results. So let's see. Thank you for coming by, Costello, and weighing in. That's good. Philip, thank you for showing your scraping and Imprimatura application technique. Is your wood panel made from plywood? It's a 5-ply oak panel. So the first panel that I showed you is a solid oak panel, and then the chalk and glue panel is a high quality plywood. So you could use 1/2 inch, 5/8. So that seems to be the best. This, I've used thinner, and it just seems to not perform as well. It's important to cradle the panel. Sometimes when you're using these techniques, depending, I live in the tropics, and the tropics are brutal to wood support. So if you're in the north, if you're in Europe or North America, the States, you probably have better luck with the humidity content. And that makes sense. I mean, I've had to adjust a lot of my techniques to the tropics because, I mean, they do make a difference. I mean, when you're using some of these materials, humidity does play an important role. So just take that into account. So let's see. Another question from Amnes, or let's see. Yep. Was the glue ground placed on a regular panel? Also, how many glue grounds were applied before the Cypress Imprimatura, or 6 layers? So this ground, the panel that you're seeing here on the top has 5 layers, 6 layers, and it was scraped smooth. This is chalk and glue, and then the smaller panel that I was scraping is gypsum and glue. So, but it's the same method, and you get similar results. It was not sealed. This panel was not sealed with any glue. It's just scraped, and then the imprimatur goes directly on top. Okay, so that's important to take into account. So if you do 4 layers, by the time that you scrape this panel smooth, you're going to go right down to the wood. So you're not going to have enough material to scrape this panel smooth with with this technique. So if you're using, there's artists that use sandpaper, or they use a machine, an electric sander. With this type of ground, if the sandpaper is not very, very fine, you're going to create scratches into the gesso, microscopic scratches that are going to distort your imprimatura. So that's why a lot of these old masters would not use, they would use a cuttlefish bone. And I don't use that technique in my panels because it kind of scratches the gesso. The best method is to scrape. That is what is described by Cennini. Is described by Edward Norgay in Miniatura. It's described by De Meyer. It's described by a lot of treatises. It's described by Palomino. They all scrape the panels. So yeah. So let's see. Can the imprimatura be done in places like Europe where you can't get lead white? So the European lead white issue is concerning. By the way, I'm uh, broadcasting from Puerto Rico, the U.S. territory. Is where I'm from, and here the lead white is really difficult to find. But I could order it from the States. And I don't know if a lot of you know that I've been recommending the RGH paints, which are amazing. I mean, if you can't find lead white, I manufacture my own lead white. I did it years ago and I made 50 pounds of stack processed lead white, enough for a lifetime, and that's those little tubes that you see here on the screen. That's what they essentially what they are. It's stack processed lead white that has been, cleaned and processed and ground and made into paint. Now, if you're in Europe and you want to do an imprimatura like this, you could try with titanium white. I'm sure you could get something similar, but the titanium white tends to be very opaque. So the lead white just seems to be, more more translucent because it has neutral lead carbonate. For a lot of you that probably follow the channel, you probably have seen some of the live presentations on lead white, and the traditional stack process lead white has a portion of neutral lead carbonate, which makes it sort of translucent. So it's a beautiful material. The RGH paints tubes are wonderful. He sells these huge caulking tubes that you could get. He sells it in cans. Years ago, I visited his shop in Albany, New York, and it's beautiful paint. The people that have used it have commented here on the channel, and they swear by it. I could also attest it's beautiful materials, but I don't think that you could get them in Europe because you're probably going to get some sort of restriction in the shipping. I believe that you need a letter if you're in Europe and you're getting something from Europe. I think Kramer may have something like this, but I cannot be sure. I know a lot of you have commented about this in the past. So, anyways, yeah, so for a lot of you that are joining and enjoy the presentation, there's a lot of content in the channel. I've gone through a lot of these techniques in depth. Um, this hopefully solves the mystery of acrylic gesso and the confusion. Acrylic gesso, just to define it once more, is not the same as the traditional gesso. Why would you use the traditional gesso? Well, you can see the luminosity that you get. Let's see, do I have another questions before we conclude our live presentation? So let's see, Emnis, so plaster of Paris topped by hydrated gypsum for the inner glow. So yeah, so apparently the plaster of Paris could be slaked. Now, I tried to buy some plaster of Paris uh, commercially the other day, and it had silica and like 3, 4 other additives. So if you go to the store and you see that the calcium sulfate has additives such as silica and plasticizers or whatever it is that they're putting in there, I don't trust that. I probably wouldn't use it. If you're interested in making your own plaster of Paris, you could do that by heating the gypsum at a specific temperature. That's another live presentation in the future. But we're gonna get to the bottom of this. So hopefully we'll define it in the future. So, anyways, I want to thank you guys for coming by. For a lot of you that are interested in this subject matter, I've had a lot of you ask me about the process of making these surfaces. So I have some of the information in some of the courses. I have a live presentation that is dedicated to Rembrandt techniques that I think I address some of these techniques as well. So through the whole library of videos that I have, you could probably dig through those and there will be more information. But in the near future, I plan to do other presentations dedicated to this subject. And I hope to help a lot of you develop some of these techniques. So let's see, one last question from Costello. The artists like Velasquez or Rubens apply a streaky imprimatura on top of a light gray oil ground before painting, since the oil ground was a substitute for the gesso ground, or was that not needed? Well, um, Rubens probably did use a type of streaky imprimatura on his oil grounds. I don't think Velasquez did as much. I think that when they would work with canvas, they didn't need to seal the surface, so it would, would lend itself to an underpainting, probably diluted with some sort of solvent and umber. I mean, you could do an imprimatura over a lead white oil ground, um, but you can't use straight oil like you would in a panel, because that would create a fatty layer. The reason that you're able to do that in the panels, because it's absorbent and it's going to die down. It's going to give you a matte surface. By the next day, this will dry matte. If you do that with an oil ground, you're going to run into problems because you're introducing too much fat in the first layer. So you probably don't want to do a fatty imprimatura. You could do a lean imprimatura by thinning down with spike oil or turpentine. If you're using turpentine, be careful in the studio because it's toxic. And the spike oil, there's a lot of concerns with the spike oil as well. I use the spike oil sparingly and I haven't had any problems with it. But the turpentine, I get nauseous. So just be aware of that. Okay, well, thank you for joining. And again, if you haven't subscribed to my channel, make sure to subscribe if you enjoy this content. And I will be back next week with more techniques and materials insights. Thank you again for joining. Have a good one, guys.